Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Encantos del Coyota wash process Peru from Kaffa Oslo. And there's the bag right there. And as always, I like to highlight bag designs that I really enjoy, as I find this to be one of the prettiest bags of coffee I have ever seen. But Kaffa, based out of Oslo, Norway, and this is our first ever full bag review of one of their coffees. But if the name sounds familiar, then that is because they did appear in our 2021 Cafe Box Advent Calendar Blind Taste Test Series, where the Buku Saisa, a natural processed Ethiopia, finished as my favorite coffee from the entire Advent calendar. And since then, I've been wanting to review their coffee, and when I saw Cafe Box carrying them, I took the opportunity to purchase both of their coffees, and I'm looking forward to discussing them, as this right here is day 67. And the recipe we went with for this coffee was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at slightly cooler temperatures at 95 degrees Celsius, about 203 degrees Fahrenheit. I like this one best through the Chemex, which of course indicates a more medium grind. Now in terms of roast profile, even though this one's listed as a light roast, I wouldn't call this one particularly light. It had a little bit more development than I think I was expecting going into it. I feel like most people would closely align this with a light medium in terms of that roast profile. Hopefully that gives you a good idea. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 46, first impression, and the cup really had a lot of milk chocolate-like sweetness right at the forefront. That was very reminiscent of a candy bar. Sugary sweet with an abundance of caramel, chocolate, and nougat. So that first impression definitely reminded me a lot of candy bars with a nice contrasting brightness to complement the very candy-forward cup. And the other thing I really noticed about this coffee was that there was a slight bit more development than I think I was expecting, but I don't think that was a negative within this coffee. If anything, I really feel like it helped kind of structure the sweetness that was coming from it. So overall, it actually left quite a positive first impression. Day 48. Ran it through the V60, and the cup really didn't seem to have the wonderful candy-like qualities at the forefront, but rather slightly more of a smoky quality to it in addition to that slight brightness. It does improve a lot with a cool down, as a lot of the candy bar-like attributes are present after it has reached about room temperature. Wonderful caramel, chocolate, and nougat yet again. So still a nice day, just not quite as enjoyable as that first experience. Day 50, ran it through the April dripper, and the coffee was the best it had been up to that point, as it was wonderfully candied at this point. There is a bit of brightness present yet again, but the coffee really does lean a lot into the more sweet candy bar-like characteristics with great clarity as well. Really enjoyable coffee on that day. Day 52, back through the V60, and the previous smokiness remains, but there's that brightness that's kind of contrasting it as well with a chocolate-forward base. It wasn't quite as sugary on this day, and this is one of the reasons I didn't enjoy it as much through the V60, as I got more smokiness and less sweetness with this method. There's a trade-off as I get a little bit more body, but I didn't necessarily find the trade-off to be worth it. Day 54, back through the Chemex, and there was a slight bit of smokiness at the forefront, but it does finish off really nice in terms of the sweetness with a strong, sugary, caramelized aspect present within the coffee. Given that this coffee was pretty well rested at this point, starting in at day 46, the only sort of changes I was going to experience was going to be from adjustments made to the coffee. And on this day, that kind of demonstrated that, as it remains slightly bright, but for the most part really candy bar-like, as these notes have been mostly consistent based off of the brew method. Day 56, lowered the temperatures and ran it through the V60 and attempted to kind of tone down a little bit of the smokiness, and it did, but it wasn't particularly worth the trade-off, as a lot more of the vibrant candy bar-like sweet components were toned down as well. So I wasn't getting as much of either, which wasn't necessarily a positive. So when I ran it back on day 58 and found a wonderful middle ground with the Chemex of lowering those temperatures, I was actually able to experience a lot more of those sugary sweet components with significantly less of the smokiness. So this was the perfect middle ground for me, as it was bright yet again, but a lot more of those chocolate bar aspects are really dominating this cup, so that made it one of the better days. Continued to roll with that on day 60, also here on day 67, where it continues to turn out really nice with the consistently slight smoky attributes, bright component as well, and the sugary candy bar-like base. All of those things kind of working together with the chocolate, nougat, and strong caramel sweetness going against that brightness present within the cup. I think that they have something like an apple note listed on here, which makes a lot of sense. That's the thing that I'm getting that's kind of countering the really wonderful candy bar-like sweetness, but I think it works out really well. That's the type of thing I really look for in these washed South American coffees. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. All right, and we have 5 level 4s, so we will start with the cleanliness, level 4. I don't think that there's too much to say about that. If anything, I mean, that's very much in line with what you would expect from a washed South American coffee. You could say maybe the smokiness played an impact on it, but for the most part, I got wonderful clarity, especially as the cup did cool down. The entire time, it was a really clean cup of coffee. So right there at level 4, not too much to say about that. Finish, level 4. Yes, that was one of my favorite parts of this coffee is as you let the coffee cool down, you experience so much of those candy bar-like attributes, most distinctly that caramel, which was so wonderful within the finish itself. Really like that part about this coffee, definitely justified that level 4 mark. Sweetness, level 4. This is a very good kind of sweetness. This is my type of sweetness, as while it may not necessarily be a fruit or a floral type sweetness, it has the really good candied-like sweetness present within the coffee. And I think that has to do with the roaster that they use. But nonetheless, it just turned out really nice in terms of that caramel as well as chocolate and just candy bar-like attributes in general. So one of my favorite parts about this coffee, in addition to the caramel, which is also at that level 4, I've been mentioning that a lot. It was one thing I experienced right at the start of this coffee, and it was consistent throughout the entire time drinking it, regardless of which brew method was used or which recipe was used. So that was one of my favorite things about this coffee. In addition to the chocolate, which worked really well because that was my type of chocolate, a more sweet milk chocolate type of chocolate. So having all those things at a level 4 is a really nice start to this coffee. Go through the level 3s real quick, and we will start with the acidity at the level 3. I actually have said before, I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of acidity, and I think even though this had a fair bit of it, that brightness that was also present, secondary most characteristic if you're just kind of lumping all the candy bar characteristics together, I liked the way it worked in this coffee. It was really nice. It added an extra layer to this coffee, and it made it quite enjoyable, so I'm very happy with it being there at that mark. Body level 3, yes. So even with the Chemex, it still did have a fair bit of body. So that's why I definitely didn't feel the trade-off with the V60 having a little bit more body was necessarily worth it, because you were still getting plenty of body in this coffee regardless. Citrus fruit, level 3, and that's typically where I lump the apple-like characteristics, and that's the thing you can most closely line this with. I would say maybe a slightly undefined acidity present within this coffee, but that's no issue with me given that I felt the candy bar-like characteristics were quite well defined. Works for me at that level 3. And I think maybe one thing we should discuss is probably the smokiness being at the level 2. That was on the higher side of the level 2, but towards the end, after making some adjustments, I feel like I was able to tone that down all the way to that level 2. So I'm really happy with the way that turned out, and I'm actually quite happy with the way that this tasting wheel turned out, and I will elaborate on why that is shortly. So my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I really liked this coffee. I think it's one of those coffees that as a South American coffee, it has the characteristics I look for in it when it does have a little bit more development to it. And I'm not necessarily saying that this is an overly developed coffee. What this coffee reminds me of a lot is a lot of Sweet Bloom's coffees. And I think that's why I really enjoyed Kaffa and that blind taste test off the first impression, is because that's just kind of the profile I get from these Kaffa coffees. And what I mean by that is that they have this very candy forward sort of coffee, very sweet, while at the same time keeping the acidity at a moderate level. So those factors made this one of the more enjoyable Peruvian coffees I've had in quite a while, and I've actually been really high on Peruvian coffees in general. So for that reason, I've been really high on this coffee. I found the candy bar characteristics very well defined and very well structured within this coffee. So for that reason, Kaffa continues to impress me. I've really liked every single one of their coffees I've had up to this point. So I'm hoping to have some more, and obviously we have another review of their coffee coming up here soon. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, definitely leaning a lot towards the candy bar-like characteristics. I've been mentioning that a lot throughout this video, but I just kind of want to nail that point home that that is the most defining characteristic here. And if you really like your sweeter side of the chocolate, the caramel, then this has those in abundance, while at the same time keeping that acidity a little bit more toned down. You're not sacrificing any body in this coffee either. Keep in mind that, as mentioned, there's a slight bit more development, so there are times you might get a little bit more smokiness from this coffee, but you can work through that, as I was able to tone down plenty of that, and as a result, I really enjoyed the way that this coffee ended up. I think I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And this right here has been a review of the Encantos del Coyota, wash process Peru from Kaffa Oslo. Thank you for watching.